Welcome to the Deep Dive.
It's Monday, May 12th, 2025.
And we're here to bring you up to speed on, well, the really crucial global shifts happening in economics and geopolitics. I'm Nick.
And I'm Pi. We've been digging through the day's developments to pull out what really matters for you.
Yeah, let's jump right in. We'll start today with a look at the global economic picture and some major news coming out of China.
Okay.
So it really looks like we might be seeing a significant turn, maybe in that long-running U.S.-China trade friction. There were these high-level talks in Geneva, and the first reports are suggesting, well, a real shift in the dynamic.
That's right. U.S. Treasury Secretary Skyt Nassan and Chinese Vice Premier Califang, they met for 2 days, and the word coming out is substantial progress.
Right.
What's interesting, I think, is how quickly they seem to have reached some kind of understanding. It's making some people rethink, how deep those disagreements really were.
Basad apparently said we should expect more details later today, Monday. And the market reaction, well, that was pretty telling straight away, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. U.S. equity futures jumped. S&P 500 was up, 1.3%?
Yeah.
And NASDAQ even more, 1.7%. And we saw that classic move away from safe havens. Gold dropped 1.2%. And U.S. Treasury yields ticked up to 4.41%. The dollar got a little stronger, too, up 0.2%.
So beyond the markets, Vice Premier Califang himself actually confirmed they'd reached an important consensus.
Yeah.
And, this seems really important, they agreed to set up a permanent mechanism for future trade talks.
That really does feel key, doesn't it, for maybe some long-term stability?
So the big question is, what does this consensus actually look like on paper?
Exactly. Citigroup analysts are already speculating. They think there could be a U.S. tariff cut maybe down to 45% sooner than people thought.
Wow, 45%.
Yeah, and they're also talking about maybe rolling back or suspending those 20% tariffs on fentanyl-related stuff and those huge 91% escalatory tariffs.
That would be a huge easing of pressure. What's China potentially putting on the table in return?
Well, the thinking is they'd probably withdraw their own retaliatory tariffs.
Makes sense.
And we might see China give some ground on things like fentanyl production, maybe buy more U.S. goods, possibly ease up on rare earth restrictions, too.
Which is interesting, considering how strongly China has talked about, U.S. economic bullying in the past. This feels like a big shift from both sides, if it holds.
It really does. Greer framed it as, a positive step towards tackling that massive U.S. trade deficit, the $1.2 trillion one. He even called it a national emergency issue.
Right, but it's worth remembering there are other perspectives. Some Chinese analysts like Yang Panpan are kind of suggesting the U.S. might be more willing to deal now because of a weakening dollar and maybe less investor confidence due to inflation.
Different angles on the same situation.
Exactly.
And Neil Thomas over at the Asia Society, he suggested that if we see a phone call between Trump and Xi soon after this,
Good.
that would be a really strong sign that the talks were truly successful, and that would probably give markets another boost.
Okay, interesting. Let's switch gears a bit now. There's another major challenge facing China, more internal this time, this demographic shift, and a really worrying drop in marriage rates.
Yeah, this is a huge one. Potentially massive long-term economic consequences. China's looking at possibly its biggest population collapse in history.
Collapse? That sounds dramatic.
Well, even conservative estimates are talking hundreds of millions fewer people over the next few decades. And making it worse is this marriage crisis.
Right.
Marriage registrations in 2024, they plunged nearly 21%. Just 6.1 million. That's the lowest since they started keeping records back in 1986.
Wow, 21% drop in 1 year. That's steep. And I guess birth rates are heading down, too.
Exactly. They go hand in hand in China, largely. The official fertility rate is hovering around 1.01.
Which is way below the 2.1 needed just to replace the population.
Way below. So yeah, China's population has actually been shrinking for 3 years straight now. And this link between fewer marriages and fewer births is really concerning for their future.
Beijing must be worried. I heard President Xi even called for, stronger cultural guidance to push marriage and parenthood.
They're definitely aware. And yeah, Xi has talked about that. We're also seeing local governments trying things out, like financial incentives.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, Chang'an County, for example, is offering a cash bonus, like 1,000 yen, for brides under 25.
Doesn't sound like much.
No. Nanding Village is trying something bigger, up to 60,000 yen if couples stay married and have 3 kids. But honestly, the evidence so far suggests these little nudges aren't really moving the needle much.
So the real reasons are probably deeper, like societal changes, economic pressure.
Yeah, exactly. You've got the high cost of raising kids, especially in cities. You've got changing values among young people. And importantly, more women are financially independent and just aren't seeing marriage as necessary or even desirable. This whole no marriage, no children idea is gaining ground.
So there's a kind of clash between the government pushing traditional family life and, well, the reality for a lot of young, especially female Chinese citizens.
Precisely. And it hits related industries too. The wedding industry, for instance. Barshare Consulting reckons it shrank from like $524 billion US in 2019 down to under $400 billion last year.
Wow.
And broader estimates put the whole wedding-related market down to maybe $2 trillion US in 2023. That's lower than during the pandemic.
And it's not just fewer weddings. Divorce is still a big factor too, right? Even with new rules.
It is. They brought in that 30-day cooling-off period in 2021. Didn't stop 3.6 million divorces last year.
Good grief.
Yeah. I mean, if these trends keep going, we could actually see more divorces than marriages pretty soon, which just makes the whole demographic picture even more complicated.
So the government's trying, but reversing this demographic slide looks like a massive challenge.
A really massive challenge. And without marriages picking up, that birth rate collapse seems likely to just keep going, making the population shrinkage and the aging problem even worse faster.
And unlike some other countries, China isn't really looking at large-scale immigration to fill the gap, are they?
No, not really. They seem focused on trying to fix it through internal cultural shifts and policies. Whether that inward-looking approach can actually tackle a problem this big, well, that's a huge question mark.
Ultimately, this demographic crunch is just a monumental hurdle for China's economic growth, isn't it? And for figuring out how to care for all those older people with fewer workers coming up behind them.
Absolutely. And if you link it back to the trade talks we just discussed, even if they get a good deal, having a shrinking, aging workforce could really limit China's long-term economic power and competitiveness anyway.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to South Asia. Things are getting really tense between India and Pakistan, and China seems to be playing a role there too.
Yes, the situation there is definitely escalating. Pakistan is claiming it launched a military operation against India, and they're accusing India of starting a major conflict. We're seeing reports of ongoing heavy artillery fire between them.
Two nuclear powers exchanging heavy fire. That's always deeply concerning.
Extremely. And adding another layer, U.S. officials have apparently confirmed Pakistan used Chinese-made J-10 fighter jets to launch missiles in this latest flare-up.
J-10s, so direct Chinese hardware involved.
Seems so. And it feeds into this narrative you hear in some Indian circles now that they're fighting two wars, an open one with Pakistan and a sort of hidden, silent conflict with China pulling strings behind the scenes.
And this latest round kicked off, reportedly, because India retaliated for some recent, pretty horrific terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
Attacks they blame on groups based in Pakistan.
That's the sequence reported, yes. What's really striking, though, is how fast the Chinese state media and sort of their online ecosystem went into overdrive with anti-India propaganda.
You mean on platforms like Weibo?
Exactly. Weibo, BU. Within hours of India's initial strikes, hashtags like hashtag India attacks and hashtag India open fired were trending, getting millions of views. A clear effort to paint India as the aggressor right from the start.
Wow, that fast.
And it wasn't just hashtags. Chinese influencers, even some official accounts, started pushing totally unverified stories, fake Pakistani victories, claims of Indian jets being shot down, things like that. Stuff that just wasn't true.
And the official Chinese media, like Global Times.
They jumped right in. Aggressive opinion pieces blaming India, conveniently leaving out the initial terror attacks. They even used phrases like warning India against bullying Pakistan.
That sounds familiar.
Eerily familiar. It echoes language used right before the 1962 Sino-Indian War.
Okay, that's chilling.
And there's more. Chinese defense commentators started reposting old PLA videos from near the Indian border in Tibet, but with captions making it seem like new deployments. State TV framed routine drills as direct threats to India, talking about countering Indian expansionism.
And by Indian expansionism, they mean Jammu and Kashmir, right?
Yeah.
The disputed territory, and specifically areas like the Shakam Valley.
Precisely. The Shakam Valley is critical context here. It's part of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, but Pakistan quietly handed it over to China back in 1963. India has never accepted that.
India's official stance, from way back in '64, is that the whole region, including Shakam and Aksai Chin, which China controls, is legally part of India, correct?
Correct. A unanimous parliamentary resolution stated exactly that. So you have this military escalation, this intense info war, and this deep historical dispute. The risk of a full-blown India-Pakistan war feels alarmingly high right now.
And if that happened, India might try to reclaim Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.
That's certainly a possibility being discussed,
Yeah.
which in turn could potentially destabilize Pakistan entirely, maybe even leading to regions like Balochistan breaking away.
And for China, that would be a disaster, wouldn't it, because of all their investment?
An absolute disaster. China's poured, what, over $60 billion into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, highways, railways, power plants, and the really crucial Gwadar port.
Right, their gateway to the Arabian
Yeah.
Sea.
Exactly. Bypassing the Malacca Strait, if Pakistan collapses or fractures, all of that investment and China's whole regional strategy is in serious jeopardy.
So Beijing must be scrambling behind the scenes to cool things down.
Reports suggest frantic diplomatic efforts, yes. They know Pakistan probably couldn't withstand a major war without direct Chinese military help. But there's also the flip side.
Which is?
China might see a collapsing Pakistan as an excuse to intervene militarily, to protect its interests.
A dangerous possibility. Either way, direct involvement or even indirect support in a major India-Pakistan war sounds like an economic nightmare for China.
Oh, absolutely. It could set them back decades economically. And then compounding all this geopolitical tension, you have this huge economic news involving Apple.
Right, the big shift in production. They've confirmed it now.
Yes, confirmed. Apple plans to move its entire iPhone production from China to India by 2026.
Entire production. How much is that worth?
We're talking around $40 billion worth of production annually. That's roughly 80% of the iPhones sold in the US. And it's not just Apple. Dell, Google, HP, Walmart, other big names are reportedly planning similar moves away from China, too.
That must be causing absolute panic in Beijing. Hundreds of billions of dollars potentially leaving. The Chinese economy just can't absorb that kind of hit easily.
No, it can't. And it's led to this really worrying theory that maybe China is actively trying to destabilize India.
To make it look less attractive for these companies.
Exactly. Look at the timing. That really deadly terror attack in India happened April 22nd. That was less than 2 weeks after the first serious rumors about Apple's move surfaced.
The sequence is concerning. India gets attacked, Pakistan-based groups claim it, India hits back, controlled strike. Then Pakistan escalates significantly with missiles and drones, forcing India to respond further.
This suggestion, basically, is that Pakistan is acting like China's pet, doing the dirty work, taking the blame, while China works to undermine India as a stable alternative manufacturing hub.
Given the CCP's history, Tiananmen, the Uyghurs, Tibet, you can't just dismiss the idea that they'd take extreme measures to protect their economic power.
Right. For them, companies leaving China on this scale might feel like an existential threat. And Apple confirming the move despite the recent attack is a huge statement. It suggests these companies see diversification as vital, maybe even factoring in potential disruption attempts by Beijing.
So the situation is incredibly fragile. China might feel cornered, economically and geopolitically. What they do next could be, well, unpredictable and potentially very dangerous for the whole region.
Definitely. It feels like we're on a bit of a knife edge. Let's maybe dig into some potential scenarios. Based on think tank analysis and wargaming, how might China actually move against India, territory by territory? Starting with Leh Ladakh, Aksai Chin.
Okay, that area is strategically vital for China, right? Linking Tibet and Xinjiang.
Hugely vital. The G219 highway runs through there. So one potential PLA playbook involves a pincer attack. Chinese forces pushing west from Aksai Chin, while Pakistani forces push east from Gilgit-Baltistan.
Trying to trap Indian forces in Ladakh,
Right.
threatening places like Sachin.
Exactly. And targeting key spots like Dolat Begoldi, India's northernmost airstrip, cutting off supply lines. They could also use rocket artillery and missiles from Tibet and Xinjiang to bombard Indian bases further back.
The ultimate goal being full control of Aksai Chin, maybe grabbing more land south, creating that land bridge with Pakistan.
That seems like the strategic objective, yes. And it would force India to pull troops away from the Pakistan border, which helps Pakistan. China's been building roads, air bases, infrastructure there for decades, preparing for something like this.
And the worry is they might see a window, maybe in the next 5 years or so, where they think they have a decisive military edge locally.
That's the concern. But as we keep seeing, war is unpredictable. Ukraine is a massive lesson there.
Right, and Ladakh is incredibly tough terrain, over 14,000 feet.
Nightmare conditions. Altitude sickness, brutal weather, logistics hell. Indian soldiers are very experienced fighting there. India's also beefed up its own infrastructure and weaponry in Ladakh significantly.
Plus, wouldn't a major Chinese attack trigger a huge international backlash? The US, Japan, Australia, France, UK, they've all deepened ties with India recently.
Absolutely. China would likely face severe sanctions, diplomatic isolation, maybe even direct arms supplies to India from multiple countries. It could spark a whole Asia-wide anti-China alliance.
Okay, what about the eastern Himalayas? Arunachal Pradesh, what China calls South Tibet.
There, the focus might be the Toang sector. It's the Dalai Lama's birthplace, so controlling it gives China leverage over Tibet, and it militarily outflanks India's eastern defenses.
Similar to what they did briefly in 1962, grabbing high ground overlooking the Brahmaputra Valley.
Potentially, yes. They might also launch simultaneous attacks further east, Dibang, Lohit Valley, trying to stretch Indian forces thin along that whole long, difficult border.
And maybe use captured territory in Arunachal as a bargaining chip later, like, we'll leave here if you give up claims on Aksai Chin.
That's a possible geopolitical play. But again, India is much better prepared in the east now. Better armed, battle-tested troops trained for jungle and mountain warfare, dug into strong defensive positions.
And the terrain there is just as bad, right? Thick forests, steep mountains, rain.
A logistical nightmare, definitely. And India's been rapidly building up airfields, roads, bases there too. So for China, it risks getting bogged down in another costly, messy stalemate, like Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, last potential flashpoint.
Right?
The Siliguri Corridor. That narrow chicken's neck connecting mainland India to the northeast states.
This one is really worrying because of the potential involvement of Bangladesh.
Bangladesh, Pakistan's offspring, historically speaking.
Right. And the new leadership in Dhaka seems to be getting much closer to Beijing. China's been pouring money into Bangladeshi infrastructure ports, bridges, even an airfield near the Indian border.
So the nightmare for India is a hostile Bangladesh on its eastern flank.
Exactly. How could China exploit that? Maybe Bangladesh allows covert Chinese surveillance near the border. Maybe even allows missile batteries that threaten Indian airspace over the corridor.
Could China also try to stir up trouble inside India's northeast, using insurgents?
That's a real risk. Funneling weapons, cash, intel to separatist groups, directing them to sabotage infrastructure, create chaos, forcing India to divert troops internally. And you could still see a northern pincer move near Bhutan, like the Doklam standoff, if India is stretched thin.
But India must have reinforced the chicken's neck, too.
Oh, significantly.
Yeah.
Advanced air defenses like the S-400 missiles are there.
Yep.
Cutting-edge Rafale jets are based nearby. Plus massive troop reinforcements, elite infantry, armor, artillery. China knows from recent border clashes how fiercely Indian soldiers fight.
So a quick, decisive victory for China seems unlikely anywhere.
Very unlikely. A drawn-out war would damage China's global image hugely. They'd become the world's biggest villain, facing UN condemnation, maybe brutal sanctions, especially from a Trump administration in the U.S.
And then there's the nuclear factor. India, China, Pakistan, all nuclear armed.
The ultimate deterrent, or the ultimate risk. One wrong move could escalate catastrophically. Pakistan's nuclear posture is particularly unpredictable.
Even without nukes, the economic fallout for China sounds immense. Losing trade with India, international sanctions, maybe even naval blockades cutting off energy imports.
Devastating. Potentially an economic nightmare for China, even if not a single enemy bullet lands on Chinese soil. India would likely align permanently with the West. Tech decoupling would accelerate. It's a huge gamble for Beijing.
A deeply concerning picture in South Asia. Okay, let's shift focus now back to the United States. What's happening there?
Well, big news on the domestic front. President Trump announced plans to sign an executive order aimed at slashing prescription drug prices.
Oh, yeah. How's he planning to do that?
It's based on a most favored nation pricing strategy. Essentially, it would mandate that Americans pay no more for prescription drugs than the lowest price paid in other developed countries.
Wow. He's claiming that could cut U.S. prices by, what, 30 to 80%?
That's the claim. He said it would bring fairness to America and reduce healthcare costs by unprecedented numbers, arguing Americans have subsidized other countries' healthcare for too long.
Has this had any market impact yet?
Oh, definitely. Asian pharmaceutical stocks took a major hit Monday morning. Big names in Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, even mainland China saw significant drops. North American pharma stocks are expected to follow.
So analysts are seeing this as pretty negative for the whole sector.
Yeah, especially for companies with heavy exposure to the U.S. market. It's worth noting, this isn't entirely new. He tried something similar in his first term, trying to tie Medicare prices to other countries, but it got blocked in court.
So this new push builds on the Inflation Reduction Act, which allowed some Medicare negotiation, but tries to go much further via executive action.
Seems to be the idea. Whether it applies just to Medicare Medicaid or tries to reach the private market is still a bit fuzzy. The industry, predictably, is pushing back hard.
Arguing high U.S. prices fund R&D and innovation.
Exactly. They warn that cutting revenues will stifle new drug development. Trump dismisses that, saying the U.S. has carried the burden unfairly.
But can he actually do this just by executive order, especially for the private market?
That's the big legal question. Analysts are skeptical about the government having the authority to impose price controls on the commercial market without Congress. And Congress is divided.
Still, Medicare and Medicaid are huge buyers, right? Like 40% of the market?
Around that, yeah. So even if it's limited to them, the impact could be massive. Just the threat has already wiped billions off pharma market caps. They're facing renewed political and financial heat, for sure.
Okay, staying with economics, what's the latest on Japan? Sounds like their economy's hit a rough patch.
It has. It looks like Japan's economy actually shrank in the first quarter of this year, 2025, about 0.3% annualized decline, according to a Bloomberg survey.
First contraction in a year. That suggests they were losing steam even before these new U.S. tariffs hit.
Seems that way. Weak domestic demand, faltering exports. Consumer spending is stagnant, partly because inflation is still eating into purchasing power. Real wages have been below pre-pandemic levels for much of the last 3 years.
Not a great picture.
No. One economist basically said, there's no engine to drive Japan's economy right now, and they're worried about another quarter of contraction, which would mean a technical recession.
That would put pressure on Prime Minister Izibo, wouldn't it? His approval ratings are already low.
Very low. So there's mounting political pressure for a new stimulus package, especially with upper house elections coming up this summer. The Bank of Japan, meanwhile, is likely to stay cautious. They just push back their inflation target timeline and cut their growth forecast.
So, any thoughts of the BOJ raising interest rates are probably off the table for now.
Increasingly looking that way, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, they're now saying any rate hike is likely delayed until 2026, or maybe even reversed later this year if things get worse.
And major exporters like Toyota must be bracing for impact from the U.S. tariffs.
They are. Toyota's forecasting maybe a 1/3 drop in profits this year because of trade uncertainty. Their CEO basically said, it's hard to plan when the tariff details are still so unclear.
And Japan's underlying potential growth is really low anyway, right? Lowest in the G7.
Just 0.6%, so even small shocks can hit them hard. UBS is even talking about Japan having its own version of stagflation, possibly needing rate cuts by year-end.
Okay, let's shift to the situation in Ukraine. Any movement on peace talks?
Some potential movement, yes. President Zelensky announced he's ready to meet President Putin in Istanbul this Thursday for direct talks.
Really? What prompted that?
Reportedly, pressure from President Trump, combined with the ongoing stalemate over getting a ceasefire actually implemented. Zelensky said he'll be waiting personally, framing it as a test of Moscow's sincerity.
This follows Ukraine calling for a 30-day ceasefire, which Russia resisted.
That's right. European leaders backed Zelensky's ceasefire call, but Moscow countered with its own proposal for talks without stopping the fighting, which, casts doubt on their commitment to de-escalation.
So Zelensky decided to go after Trump pushed him.
Apparently, Trump urged Kyiv to agree to this immediately on Truth Social, saying Putin seemed open and they needed to find out if a deal was possible, expressed some frustration with Ukraine's reluctance before.
If it happens, it would be the first face-to-face meeting since when?
Since Paris in December 2019, there were talks in Istanbul back in 2022, but they failed.
And Russia's demands haven't really changed, have they? Neutrality, no NATO, recognize annexed territories, and Western military aid.
Those seem to be the long-standing demands, yes. And Russian officials keep saying talks have to address the initial reasons for the war first before any ceasefire terms. European leaders, meanwhile, just visited Kyiv Saturday, showing support for Zelensky's ceasefire push.
So it's still very uncertain if the talks will even happen on Thursday or if they'll achieve anything.
Highly uncertain. But Zelensky saying he's ready is at least a fragile diplomatic opening, while Ukraine keeps pushing for a halt in the fighting. The world will be watching Russia's response very closely.
Okay, one last major item today. This sounds significant, an energy deal between Canada and China.
Yes, reports are calling it a seismic energy agreement. Beijing and Ottawa have apparently finalized a deal for Canada to funnel millions of barrels of crude oil to Chinese refineries.
Wow. That's a big shift for Canada, isn't it? moving beyond just selling to the U.S.
It's a huge strategic move for them, diversifying away from the U.S. market, getting a foothold in China's economy. And for China, it offers a reliable, politically stable source of high-quality crude.
And the timing seems pointed, given the new U.S. administration's tariffs on Canadian goods.
Very much seen as a direct response, Canadian oil producers were feeling the pinch from stalled pipelines and higher transport costs due to U.S. policies, so Ottawa pivoted to Asia.
And it's more than just selling oil, there's cooperation involved.
Reportedly, yes. Joint research on low-carbon extraction, co-funding for Pacific export terminals. It's framed as a strategic partnership.
How is that likely playing in the U.S. energy sector? Must feel like a betrayal.
That's probably the word some would use. U.S. refiners rely heavily on Canadian heavy crude. This could force them to find costlier, lower-quality alternatives or push for more domestic drilling, with all the costs that involves. Tighter margins, operational challenges are likely.
Could reignite energy security debates in the U.S. too.
Definitely. And the ripple effects go beyond North America. Europe's watching. It might ease global oil prices slightly as Canadian crude heads to Asia. Could even push Russia or others to offer better deals elsewhere.
And for China, it's a diplomatic win, showing they can build partnerships despite U.S. pressure.
Exactly. And it's happening even as the EV revolution accelerates. Interestingly, the deal apparently ties oil exports to cooperation on low-emission tech and securing critical minerals like cobalt and nickel from Canada.
So Canada's leveraging its oil to also build its clean tech and battery sectors.
Seems to be the strategy. Maybe linking oil sales to joint ventures between Canadian clean tech firms and Chinese auto giants.
Meanwhile, U.S. diplomats are reportedly feeling outmaneuvered.
That's the word. A sense that maybe their America First policies inadvertently pushed Canada into China's arms. Some U.S. lawmakers are apparently suggesting a more nuanced approach might have kept Canada closer.
And China gets leverage in both oil and critical minerals now. How's it being received in Canada?
Generally positive from political leaders, astute statecraft, boosting the oil sector.
Yeah.
Lots of enthusiasm in Alberta, obviously. West Coast ports gearing up for more tanker traffic. But predictably, environmental groups are raising alarms about emissions and risks.
Has the government addressed those concerns?
They're emphasizing safety standards and earmarking some oil revenues for coastal protection. China, meanwhile, is framing it as a win for energy security and favorable pricing, insulating them from Middle East volatility and OPEC cuts. The high-quality Canadian crude also helps with their emission goals and carbon capture tech development.
What's the immediate market reaction been?
Oil futures ticked up a bit in Asia. Canadian energy and infrastructure stocks surged. U.S. oil majors dipped slightly. Credit agencies are warning, though, that the long-term picture depends on geopolitical stability.
So Washington's considering its next move. Retaliatory tariffs, or maybe trying to reset things with Canada.
Both seem possible, but the core lesson might be that economic coercion can backfire, leading to these kinds of strategic realignments.
And on the ground, we're seeing more activity in Alberta, Chinese investment.
Yes, increased activity, investment, modernization efforts. In BC, coastal communities have mixed feelings, economic benefits versus ecological worries, plus First Nations demanding consultation. The government set up tripartite forums, Ottawa, Beijing, Indigenous groups to manage that.
And in China, practical benefits.
Stable, high-quality crude for industrial hubs like Guangzhou, Tianjin. Feedstock security supporting their Made in China 2025 plan. Plus, joint research programs kicking off between universities on carbon capture tech, student exchanges, co-investment funds.
But U.S. politics could still influence how this plays out.
Definitely. The White House is sticking to America First, but there's debate about alienating Canada. Europe, especially Germany, sees an opportunity to boost its own energy ties with Canada, maybe revising LNG projects. Brussels might even adjust carbon rules to favor cleaner Canadian fuels.
So it's creating ripples everywhere, new business opportunities too.
Yeah, private equity in pipelines, new shipping contracts, clean tech startups partnering on carbon management and with Indigenous groups. Security implications are being debated to sea lanes, potential joint naval exercises.
Fascinating. It seems like this deal is touching almost every aspect of international relations.
It really is. For China, it's symbolic of their global reach. In Canada, it fuels debates about economic diversification versus relying on oil. Technologically, there's potential for breakthroughs from joint research. It's being seen as maybe a model for balancing energy needs and climate goals. New trading benchmarks are even emerging.
And they've set up a formal council to manage it all.
A standing Canada-China Energy Council, yes. For oversight disputes, future collaboration. Though legislative debates continue in both Canada and the US about the benefits versus the risks, especially reliance on Chinese tech, ancillary deals are popping up too: logistics, green finance, cultural diplomacy efforts as well.
So a really complex and evolving situation driven by this energy pact.
Definitely one to watch closely. It touches on trade, geopolitics, energy transition, technology.
Everything, really.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. Potential shifts in U.S.-China trade, China's internal demographic headwinds, the dangerous situation heating up between India and Pakistan with China involved.
Plus major policy moves on U.S. drug pricing, Japan's economic concerns, the fragile hope for Ukraine peace talks, and this really significant Canada-China energy deal.
It's a complex picture out there, and it really makes you think, doesn't it? What are the real long-term consequences of all these shifting alliances and trade flows for businesses, for you as a consumer? And how will these big demographic shifts, especially in China, reshape the global order down the line? What does this Canada-China pact truly signal about where energy security and international alliances are heading? Lots to consider.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth analysis today. We hope it's given you some valuable context.
Yeah, thanks for listening. If you found this useful, please do consider liking, subscribing, or maybe supporting our work. It helps us keep bringing you these deep dives.